Hello and welcome to Language Secrets. We're talking about the tricks to help you get from one language into another language. It's essentially all about patterns. Interesting patterns that you might never have thought about or might never have had even pointed out to you.
Let's dive straight in with a word that you will certainly have seen in the phrase books, and you will have used this word if you've driven in Western Europe, the word for full, as in tank full, please. There's one little word that came out of Latin and ended up in Spanish and in Italian and in French and in Portuguese, but each of those languages bent it out of shape in their own distinctive way. And the root word that we're talking about here, the Latin word, is pleno, as in plenitude.
The French, arguably, out of all of these languages, stuck closest to the Latin original word pleno. The French word for full being plein. If you know what pleno in Latin means, you could probably work out what plein means. The Italians stayed pretty close as well with their word for full, which is PIENO, not that different to pleno either.
Let's talk about the Spanish and the Portuguese. Now, this takes us on to slightly dangerous territory because neither of us really is terribly confident about our Portuguese pronunciation, which is a dark art if you ask me. So we've decided to rope in a bit of extra help here, or at the very least a second opinion. When we try to give you our best shot at a Portuguese pronunciation, the second opinion we're going to turn to is going to come from Siri, which has a pronunciation engine for Portuguese, and there is a Siri lady whose name, well, it looks to me like Joanna, but what is your name, Siri pronunciation lady?
Joanna.
Oh, that's the English. Right, what is your name, Siri pronunciation lady?
Joanna.
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 More like Joanna.
Joanna.
Coming back to the example at hand, I don't think many people would guess at what the Spanish made out of the Latin pleno. They ended up with lleno, that y sound being represented in writing by a double L. And the prize for perversity goes to the Portuguese, who have come up with the word that you can see on the screen now, and the pronunciation of that word would go something like
CHEIO.
CHEIO. So it goes from pleno to CHEIO.
So you might be thinking, how do we know that those two words are even related at all? And the answer is because the Portuguese have done that before and they've done it with other words. If we take, for example, the Latin word pluere, meaning to rain, and look at what the Portuguese did, we end up with something that's like llover.
Chover.
Llover. Yeah, you'd never be able to spot a link there unless you knew.
So what's going on here? Basically, Latin words that had a combination of consonants at the beginning, such as PL, a compound consonant, generally had a hard time when they migrated into these daughter languages.
Interestingly, only the French language were happy to keep that P and the L together like you have in the original Latin. The other languages found a way to boil it down and simplify it over time.
So what did they each do? Well, Italian tended to chuck out the L and replace it with a letter I, so the sound that you end up with becomes a P sound. Let's go back and look again at pleno. Well, sure enough, as we said earlier, we end up with PIENO in the Italian. And what did Italian do with pluere? Well, it's going to start with a pia, and sure enough, the word that we end up with is piovere. Is that about right?
Piovere.
Piovere. Piovere, the Italian verb meaning to rain.
So again, looking at Spanish, we saw that they took pleno in Latin and came up with lleno, the Spanish word for full. If we just unpack that, that is what the Spanish do when confronted with a Latin word starting with PL. They drop the P totally. They keep the L sort of, but only in the written. When they speak, you don't hear that at all. It becomes a y sound, like in lleno.
So what did the Spanish actually do with pluere? Well, it's going to start by dropping the P and just going in with the y sound. And the Spanish verb meaning to rain is llover. We will talk a little bit more about that double L business in a minute because it's got an interesting history, and apparently it's called a palatal lateral articulation consonant phoneme. Did you know that?
First I've heard
I
of that.
didn't know it either.
Rolls off the tongue though. Expect they're learning about that in primary school nowadays.
They probably are with their triglyphs.
Looking at that word pluere again, the French language is happy to keep that pleu sound. Pluere in French has become something relatively similar to the original pleuvoir.
And in fact, the French were pretty relaxed about adopting other compound consonants at the start of Latin words, such as CL and FL. So the Latin word for key, clave, is not completely hidden when you look at the French equivalent clef, which is where we get our treble clef and bass clef from, for example. And the Latin for flame, flamme, shows up in French as flamme, la flamme. No prizes at all for being able to guess the meaning of that one.
The Italians, though, much like with the PL letter combinations, were not happy with the CL and the FL. In all of these cases, they do the same thing. They're happy to stick with the original consonant, but they knock off the L and instead replace it with an I, which creates a Y sound. Clave becomes chiave in Italian, meaning key. Flamma becomes fiamma in Italian, meaning flame.
The Spanish too evidently struggled to accept these words that began with CL or FL, and their approach to them was exactly the same as the way they had approached PLENO. They just went straight for the Y sound represented by a double L. So the clave that we saw in Latin, meaning key, in Spanish that becomes llave, and the same Y sound was used to deal with the Latin flamme. So the Spanish for flame is llama. And for some reason, they also use that word for the South American woolly mammal. I have no idea why.
So what did the Portuguese do when they came across these Latin words starting CL or FL? Well, they got rid of the CL and the FL totally, replacing them with a sh sound. If we look at the Latin word clave, meaning key, and look at what the Portuguese did, they came up with something like chave, is that right?
Q Joanna.
Chave.
Chave. Pretty good. If we look at the Latin for flame, which is flamma, they got rid of the FL, replaced it with a sh sound, and ended up with something like shama?
Chama.
Shama. Shema, maybe.
Llama.
Yeah.
It's maybe not surprising that Portuguese ended up being so remote from the Latin, because if you think about it, Rome to Paris is about 900 miles, Rome to Lisbon is more like 1500 miles, so it could just be a simple question of geographical distance. One thought to conclude with here: we've been talking as though Portuguese and Spanish are taking a pretty different solution from each other, in that Portuguese ends up with that sh sound at the start of these words represented by the CH combination, whereas Spanish is going for the Y sound represented by that double L thing. But
yeah, it's maybe not as different as it initially seems to an English speaker. Lots of Spanish speakers, when confronted with this double L, don't pronounce it as a Y at all. Quite often you hear it pronounced as a J sort of sound. Instead of me llamo, you often hear me llamo. If you take that sound and compare it with the Portuguese, it's not so different. That sh and that j, they're much harder sounds.
so that's kind of suggesting that Portuguese and Spanish really are a fairly tight little group, a sort of subgroup of the Romance languages on their own. Just one other little factoid to conclude on, just a little nugget. I was talking about how llama, why is the Spanish word for flame the same as the Spanish word for the South American beast of burden? I've got no clue about that. But in that same list of household items in Spanish, of course, there was the word for blanket.
Sure.
La manta.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, I could remember that as being a bit like manta ray, spelt the same way. And then I thought, I visualised, you see on TV underwater footage of a manta ray, it's like a blanket sort of flapping around under the sea. And actually, that is why it's called a manta ray.
Really?
They're saying it's a blanket ray.
And that is interesting.
That one actually is.
Hopefully you've enjoyed hearing us talk about languages in this way. Maybe you've learnt something. If you have, please give it a like. I should point out notes will be in the description box below if you want to check spelling or just have another look at what we've been talking about visually written down. Crucially, if you have enjoyed it, share it with someone else, please, who you think might also enjoy it.
And if we get enough positive feedback, you never know, we might get it together to finally sort of branch out into talking about the Germanic languages, English, German, the Scandinavian languages. So yeah, if you have liked it, let us know. Thanks for watching.